Thank y'all so much. So I love summer for a lot of reasons. I don't love summer for the heat, as y'all well know. If you come at all or hear me speak, you know I don't enjoy the heat. But I love summer. I love that we get to slow down for a moment. I also love the fact that people are able to get away and spend some time together as family. One of the funniest things I've seen, and I've seen it several times this summer on Facebook, families have gone on vacation and they have young children, and their young children have come upon this device that they've never seen before. And their parents take pictures of them trying to figure out what it is and how to use it. It's a payphone. Several pictures this summer of children holding this thing in their hands and looking at it and kind of figuring out eventually that you put it to your ear and there's buttons, and they really can't figure out exactly why in the world would you need one of these things. Communication, the way we communicate has changed. There just aren't words to describe how much forms of communication have changed in the history of humankind. What's crazy to think about is how rapidly the ways we communicate have changed just in my lifetime. There have been a couple times recently when someone has called me, and then they've texted me, and then they've emailed me, all within about 5 minutes because I didn't answer the phone, I didn't respond to the text. There used to be a day and time when we would go hours without access to a communication device. We've created this expectation in our world that we're all available immediately because we all have these things in our pockets, in our homes. One of my colleagues who moved this year from one church to another, and he's a younger person, earlier this week he posted that as soon as he plugged in his home phone, he got a series of telemarketing calls. And I was just waiting. I was just watching because I was trying to bet how many responses it would take. 2 responses in, your first mistake was having a home phone. Communication has gotten down to where we expect that we can immediately have access to each other. There are a couple places I want us to look at this morning as we think about communication. As I said to the children this morning, we're in a series called Common Ground. And the origin of this series is obviously over the last weeks and months. Our country has been pulled in a lot of different directions. We have been divided on many issues. And it is often the case, and when we have these issues that are so divisive, I often find myself smack in the middle. I can often see clearly and articulate clearly both sides of any given disagreement. But also can see in the media and in my social media and on news and in various ways how divided we are. And so I think the message of the church ought to be trying to find common ground. I'm going to be clear, not that we're going to agree on everything, but that we find that place where we can agree and we work from there. And so there's a Latin root, communis, 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 which is the root of communion, communication, community, and common. The same root for all of those words. And it really talks about getting to the very basics of who we are. So last week we thought for a few minutes together about communion. This morning I want you to think with me a few minutes about communication. couple places I want us to go. Several weeks ago when we celebrated Pentecost, we went to the book of Acts and to the birth of the church, and I won't read the whole thing for you, but in the story of the birth of the church in the book of Acts, in the second chapter, it's talking about all of those who had gathered there in one place. And it says this in the second half of verse 11, "In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." What we have to do is we have to refer back to Genesis, the 11th chapter, and the Tower of Babel. Because in Genesis 11, what we remember or learn is that the whole earth had one language. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And then they said, "Let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth." God sees what's going on and is not real comfortable with this because they said they wanted to make a name for themselves. And God said, "Let us come down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other's speech." And the Lord scattered them all over the face of the earth. And they stopped building the city and the tower. And therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad all over the earth. So early on, we're told in the book of Genesis that we all had the same language and we could communicate. And when we could all communicate together, the first thing we decided to do was to try to take things in our own hands. We were going to make a name for ourselves rather than to glorify God. We fast forwarded to the book of Acts and we realized that what God is doing after we have had the good news of the gospel through Jesus Christ is that God is once again reconciling us not just to God but to each other, such that although we still had different languages in the book of Acts at the birth of the church, each was able to understand in his or her own native language. The story I've told many times to illustrate that I still think holds true today is the time I had the opportunity to spend in Paris and watching a group of school children gather in a park. And the school children sat down in a circle, and one of the school children got up and started walking around the circle, touching the heads of the other children, saying some word that I didn't understand. And eventually they would say a different word, and they'd tap a child with a more firmness on their head or their shoulder, and they would start running around the circle, and that other child would go and chase them. What were they playing? Duck, duck, goose. I didn't have to understand a word of French. All I needed to do was observe what they were doing. And it's so true of us today. Last week on the front steps of the church, we were out there playing cornhole, and a gentleman walked up, and he's kind of looking at us, and he's a little puzzled by what we're doing, and he motions as to ask if he could come up. Well, absolutely, come up here. We learned that he was from Vietnam, and he was in Atlanta for a conference, and they have a similar game in Vietnam, but he was holding the bean bag slightly differently. But within a few minutes, he'd gotten the hang of it. See, the thing is that we think we're so radically different from the rest of the world, and we only need to look as far as children playing to realize just how much we have in common. Bring together a group of children, different backgrounds and different languages, and watch how quickly they can organize a game. It's been called the world's game. The U.S. has been slow to adopt it. But the game of soccer hit a high note last Sunday evening. More people watched the finals of the Women's World Cup than watched the last game of the NBA Finals, the last game of the Stanley Cup Finals, or Game 6 of Major League Baseball. You can go in just about every country in this world, developed or undeveloped, and you will see children, some on grass, more often than not on dirt, playing soccer. I promise you, you could gather children from all over this world, put them on the field and throw a ball in the middle, and they would know exactly what to do and how to play. We have far more in common than we want to admit. And part of the challenge we have is we just have lost the ability to communicate. In the book of James, in the 3rd chapter, the words and the admonition is a little more firm. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and it is self set on fire by hell. Not too flowery of language about our tongues. Later in the chapter, with it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. In other words, we praise God and we curse God's children with the same tongue. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. One of the most difficult things to learn is that what we say is important. How we say it may be more important. And we cannot take back words once they're gone. We can try to backtrack, backpedal. In the world of politics, we call it spin. Well, that's not what I really meant to say. I mean, that's one of my favorite things in the world. This is what you heard, but this is what I said. The problem is whatever we heard is what we heard. No matter what, and whatever someone hears us say, might as well be what we said. Because if that's what the person heard, that is how they have received it. It blows me away, the many ways that we can communicate and the distances over which we can communicate. And this is nothing new. I still am just absolutely fascinated how when we first went to the moon, that we could communicate with astronauts standing on the surface of the moon. More recently, we have space probes that are deep, deep in space. And they'll go to sleep for a while, and all of a sudden, they'll wake up and they'll send a signal back to Earth from millions and millions and millions of miles away. I've said this before too. The craziest thing is that we're sitting in this sanctuary this morning, and you can't see it, but all around our heads are flying zeros and ones. Binary, the code with which almost all computers are based. It's an off or an on. It's as simple as that. I mean, the basics of computers, and that's about all I understand, so I'll stop there. But the fact of the matter is that there are just this series of zeros and ones that are flying throughout this sanctuary. But here's the thing, and I think this is the most important thing that we can hear this morning. We have never in the history of humankind been more connected than we are today. And we have never in the history of humankind been less engaged with each other. Let's hear that again. We've never been more connected than we are today, and we've never been less engaged. We've all seen it. It's cliche, but it's true. How many of us have been at a restaurant, looked at the table next to us, family of 4, and they all have their heads buried in a device? How many of us have seen that? How many of us have been guilty of that? You don't have to answer that one. I will say, Shannon and I talk a lot about it. We're still trying to figure out this parenting thing. Zach and Shannon and I together trying to figure out this parenting thing. But I think one of the things we did as parents, and again, there's a lot of things we haven't done well, but from very early on, one of the rules was there are just certain times when we don't have devices, and at the dinner table is one of them. We do not have anything electronic around the table while reading. And we avoided the temptation to put a DVD player in the car even early on, that even when we were traveling. And we were doing longer trips, we would. But for just around town, we figured we could probably talk to each other in the car while we were riding around. Here's the thing. In fact, many ways it's become easier to be disengaged. I've talked about this before too, but we've got to hear this. And I think it's a theme that has to run through all of what we teach and preach in the church. The relative anonymity of the internet allows us and causes us to say and do things we would never say or do to someone's face. We realize on the other side of a screen that we don't have to face the immediate consequences of what we type on social media or in an email. We're immune from those consequences, at least for a while. I heard it described once in seminary. We don't talk to each other, we talk past each other. How many of you are familiar with the term full duplex in communication? If you just one. Okay, so I talked to the children this morning about walkie-talkies. When communication first started, we did not have full duplex communication. And what that meant was we could talk, and then we would say something like over. And that would let the person on the other end of the line know we were through speaking, and then they could speak. It seemed onerous and inefficient at the time because you had to talk, and it was long periods of time, and there was a gap. But you would talk and say over, and the person on the other end would then speak in return. Full duplex was meant to be an advancement in communication because suddenly I could respond to you as you were talking to me, and we could hear each other at the same time. But earlier this week, I was on what is the bane of my existence. Some of you, this is a lot of what you do for a living, and God bless you, and my prayers are with you. I was on a conference call. There's nothing more painful in the world to me than a conference call. Because now you don't just have two people that can talk at the same time. You got like 20 people who can talk at the same time. But what I realized is on this particular, I don't know if it was just not a good connection, but we couldn't really hear each other if more than one person was talking. So whoever was talking, everyone else had to be quiet and listen. Everyone else had to stop and pause and listen. And it was good to have to listen. It was important to be able to hear each other. The challenge is in our communication today is we don't listen to each other. And the only way we're going to find common ground is being willing to listen. We hear what we want to hear. We say what we want to say. But we're not willing to engage each other in important ways. We have lost the ability to disagree with dignity, to have civil discourse about the important issues of our time. We would rather lob one-liners at each other or argue 140 characters at a time. I started this off talking about Facebook and how wonderful it is, and it is this incredible gift, and we've talked about this. It's an incredible gift that for me is used to keep up with family and friends. It's an important gift that allows me to stay connected with people that I had long since lost touch with. It is not an adequate forum for discussing the issues of the day. Race, human sexuality, religion, politics, public policy. Yeah, we can lob some grenades at each other on the internet. But if we're going to solve any of these issues, if we're going to find common ground on any of these challenges, it's going to be face to face in the same room, talking to each other, just as one of our children told us this morning. We have got to learn like the early church did. We have got to learn like the early church did to hear each other in our own language. But most importantly, we must learn first to hear and to listen. And most importantly than that, listen for God's still small voice calling us to serve Him and to love each other. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.